I'd now like to introduce you all to Ethan Tapper. Ethan has been the Chittenden County Forester for 5 years. Ethan was very engaged and helpful in the Huntington Community Forest Project, and we really appreciated his involvement and support. He graduated from UVM in 2012, and although Tony wasn't at UVM when Ethan was a student, he considers him a mentor. And Ethan was also instrumental in setting up this program tonight. So I'd like to turn the program over to Ethan to introduce our speaker. Thanks, Ethan.
Thanks, Jennifer. It's nice seeing so many familiar faces here. And it's just such a pleasure to be able to introduce Tony. Tony is such an important part of our forest management community here in Vermont. He's just incredibly generous, as well as being an incredibly important and groundbreaking scientist in our field that's introducing all kinds of really, really important dimensions and layers to our work that are massively enriching the way that we take care of our forests and practice forestry. Tony is the author of well over 100, I think he said more than 150 peer-reviewed articles. And most recently, the author of the book Ecological Silviculture, Foundations and Application, which is literally the textbook on ecological silviculture. And his really important work focuses on understanding both natural and managed forest systems and how we manage forests in a responsible way in light of changing global conditions and societal objectives. And so without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Tony Domano. Thanks, Tony.
Yeah, thanks, Ethan, for that really nice introduction. And for being affiliated with UVM Forestry, I'm always very proud to get to claim your roots in our program, because it's always so inspiring to get to go out with you and certainly hear many things that you could explain a heck of a lot better than I can, but I'm the one that gets to talk tonight, so that's fine. And also Liz is on the call too. So I have two folks that are better prepared to give this presentation to me, but I'm thrilled to be here and talk about ecological forestry. And as Ethan mentioned, we have a textbook on ecological silviculture. And so you'll hear me here use those two terms interchangeably throughout the presentation. But really the goal tonight is to give some folks some familiarity with what this approach to forestry looks like. I recognize, there's a range of experience in forestry and in forest ecology on this webinar. And so my goal is hopefully to make it interesting to most of you and hopefully provide some new insights to some on the call. But again, I know that Ethan and Liz will checking email or something else during this, but that's okay. So what I start off doing is just giving people kind of a framing for why we're even talking about ecological forestry and how it fits into just some of the broader challenges that we face here in Vermont. And then I'll get into talking a little bit about just the origin of these ideas around ecological forestry and how they might differ a bit from maybe some of the general stereotypes we have around forest management and production of wood products, and that being kind of a primary output from forests. But if there's nothing else you'd take away from this presentation tonight and thinking about that concept, and again, I know that via Ethan's writings and his work with each town and the conservation commissions, you're already all familiar with this, but we really view ecological forestry as a tool that allows us to really enhance many of the benefits that forests provide us in terms of biodiversity conservation, resilience to global change, and certainly providing many social and economic and certainly ecological benefits across the landscape. And so I'll try to highlight those as we go throughout today. So just to kind of start off, we're talking about ecological forestry in a complex world. And again, I don't need to really remind folks too much that we are dealing with a complex scenario here in Vermont and certainly across the region. This is the map of kind of how we're doing right now for precip. None of us need to look at a map to know that this has been a very strange, hot, dry spring. Things are accelerating at a pace that really is unprecedented relative to maybe 5 decades ago when we might have seen some similar trends, but not to this degree. And so we're clearly dealing with just shifts in phenology, shifts in seasonality, and grappling with what these drier conditions, as well as what these kind of almost too much rain conditions that also come throughout the year are going to mean for future forests in the landscape. Likewise, unfortunately, all of you are intimately familiar with emerald ash borer and kind of what it means and how it feels even emotionally when that's found in your town, in your county, and kind of how that changes your perspective on a species, on a forest, and kind of how we think about our landscapes and managing them. And unfortunately, emerald ash borer is not the last insect or disease that is going to be impacting Vermont that we don't have kind of a silver bullet solution for. And so thinking about ways in which we can address these really novel challenges and sustain a lot of the values that we also have across the landscape. Beyond thinking about introduced insects and diseases, another forestry alum I'm very proud of, Will Dunkley here on the La Platte Headwaters area. I'm holding a prized multiflora rose, although I know there's some pretty incredible specimens in other parts of Chittenden County that might get the champion. But invasive species beyond just insects and diseases really impact how we think about the future of our forests and our ability to do things. And often compounding that are other things like high levels of herbivory from deer. This is a picture of what was the duff layer, basically gone. You can see the fine roots where my pointer is. This is a heavily earthwormed soil, so European earthworms are impacting this site. And then, of course, what we certainly seem to be experiencing in many years, these more frequent downburst events, the storm events, impacting our forests and impacting those dynamics. And so we are dealing with kind of a changing scenario across our landscape, and one that certainly has us concerned and thinking about ways in which we can sustain all the values that we get from our forests. At the same time, some of the complexity we deal with is that we aren't that complex anymore. And what I'll be talking about a lot today is how we use active management and ecologically based management as a way to diversify and introduce heterogeneity into our forests. And a lot of the motivation for that, whether it's in Vermont or in Oregon or in Chile, has really been motivated by people recognizing we've had a huge impact on our landscape historically and often homogenized it from what we viewed as more of a natural condition that certainly was impacted in places by indigenous uses, but more broadly had a much more complex signature to it. And as an example, many of you might be familiar with these maps. On the left here, I have a map put together by Charlie Cogbill and others that just depicts, based on town survey records at the time of kind of when they were laying out the towns in New England, as well as New York and Pennsylvania, what the dominant tree species were at these survey corners when they were laying out the town boundaries. And you can see fairly clearly in Vermont, although when you get in the Northeast Kingdom, you start seeing more green, but largely beech was one of the more common species that they were encountering. And if we look at that at those exact same points today and look at dominant composition for those that can distinguish color here, you can see a pretty strong red signature. So that maple has become much more abundant across our landscape, at least as a dominant tree in these locations relative to historic times. And so we've even had this whole-scale shift both in the structure of a species, with beech no longer being very abundant as a large tree due to beech bark disease, but also just an increased abundance of maple across our landscape, partially due to us leaving some great maple seed sources behind as a source of maple syrup historically. And much of this is what was happening with large landscape clearings. So again, many are familiar with the large agricultural clearing in Vermont, as well as kind of repeated harvesting for more industrial uses. And so we've gone from a fairly complex condition from the perspective of composition to one in which we like to market it for our foliage, but that orange we see on many hillsides throughout Vermont should be a reminder that we have a lot of homogeneity, even of our composition across the region. And so certainly we're dealing with this scenario that may or may not be beneficial when we look at future change, as well as what that might do for supporting biodiversity and other functions. Related to this, besides looking at composition, it's also worth evaluating what has that heavy impact of historic land use done in terms of the diversity of aged forests we have in Vermont. And throughout today, I'll be talking about kind of emulating natural systems, and a lot of what we think of with a natural forest condition for much of Vermont and much of New England is an old, multi-aged forest. We don't have ecosystems that experience fire every 100 years. In general, big disturbance events in Vermont and elsewhere often happen, 3 times the average lifespan of our average canopy trees. And so it might be 1,000 years before an entire area would be disturbed by a fire or a large windstorm. And so historically, we would assume that we had quite old and quite complex forests across the landscape. And so this picture here on the left, just to give you an idea, this is a beautiful forest, right? Really nice sugar maple and actually very rich. It's loaded with nettles down near Okemo. But from an ecological perspective, all these trees are the exact same age. In terms of the actual structure of this forest, it's quite simple. Even though again, it's a wonderful forest and doing a lot of great functions relative to what we would have expected across the landscape. That's not was not have been a common condition. And ironically, that picture in the lower left-hand corner is what we have a lot of across Vermont. Forests that are anywhere between 60 to 100 years old. It's this really common, I wouldn't even call it middle-aged, slightly past the teenage years in the life of a tree, and that we are dealing with a pretty simplified forest condition. And so when we look at some of the trends that are happening in the region, both in terms of dynamics with loss of species diversity, both in terms of plant and tree species, but also in terms of bird species, often folks will think about, is some of this being driven by the fact that we don't have a tremendous amount of heterogeneity in habitat and structure across the region. And so even though I get pretty excited about exotic species like yellow birch, I know others get more excited about things like birds. And so what I have here is a trend from an awesome source. The Forest Ecosystem Monitoring Cooperative has a data dashboard that some of you might be familiar with, but you can go on there and look at different ecosystem indicators for Vermont and see how they're doing. And this is just showing forest bird diversity based on the great long-term data sets that the Vermont Center for Eco Studies has collected. And what we generally see is this downward trend. And this has been published upon by folks at Vermont Center of Eco Studies if you want to look it up. But a lot of what they attribute this downward trend to are two things. One, we're losing forest and we're also fragmenting forests in the region. And I think many of you are hopefully familiar with that. We've actually lost forest land in Vermont over the last 10 years for the first time in over 100 years. But what also is happening here is we don't have a lot of heterogeneity in structure and composition across the landscape. And so when we look at the needs of many of these bird species, both within stands and across the landscape, we have a pretty uniform, again, awesome forest, but not a lot of variety in what's happening across our region. And so the last complexity I'm going to get into really is less to do with ecology and more to do with our behavior in a state. When we're talking about trying to use management and use tools to deal with both local issues, but also global issues. And so one thing, someone that works in forestry and spends a lot of time, around the globe and around the country and thinks about equity and thinks about global carbon budgets and all of these attributes, but also comes home to a state like Vermont, although I don't travel much, nor have any of us over the past year. What's really interesting about Vermont is a state that's so forested and really so committed to the local brand for so many things. When it comes to our use of wood products and our use, whether it be for packaging, the toothpaste that you used this morning likely has cellulose in it, building, even furniture to some degree, there's really not a premium or an emphasis by most Vermont wood consumers around where the wood comes from. Really, we are globivores when it comes to where our wood comes from here in Vermont. We're getting it from everywhere. And in general, if you look at kind of the global wood estate, almost half of the wood that anyone uses in any given day is coming from plantations. So this picture here, most folks, we don't have them in Vermont, so except for really old ones from the CCC era. But a lot of our wood that's being supplied either here in Vermont or other parts of the globe, here's a shipping port in Olympia sending Douglas fir from the Pacific Northwest around the globe, really are coming from these areas that are being very simplified and used for producing wood products. And so I'm going to be thinking about using ecological forestry on Vermont's landscapes, using active management on Vermont's landscape. And part of that, is not only to kind of increase complexity from an ecological perspective, but as we look at our landscape from a carbon perspective, as we look at how we consume goods and what that means both for our carbon footprint, but also for how it impacts other parts of the globe if we're not producing it here. A key part of what we need to grapple with in Vermont and the rest of the region is that we really export a lot of our wood needs elsewhere. And so even though we can give kind of the locavore champion to somebody in Vermont, when it comes to eating, when it comes to forest products, we can get a participation medal. We do, we'll have some awesome local wood. And here's my son. So I keep him entertained in the forest, bring a football to make it really fun. The equipment's not enough for him. We are producing wood products in the state. I mean, we have great loggers, great foresters, great mills. But in general, relative to many other parts of the globe and even the states around us, we really export a lot of our needs elsewhere and rely on other states to produce that. And so it's certainly something we need to be thinking of as global citizens besides proud citizens of the state of Vermont. So I'm going to get into ecological forestry and first certainly start out with a definition and get everybody kind of calibrated with what I'm referring to when I talk about ecological forestry. and provide a little bit of context as to where does this fit in our landscape, both in Vermont, but kind of more broadly, how do folks view this form of forestry fitting in relative to other forms, as well as, great strategies like not doing anything and conserving and protecting wildlands. And so I'll go into that and then talk through just some of the main principles that we kind of think of as guiding how we approach forestry through an ecological lens, and what that might mean both from traditional perspectives of commodity production, but also certainly biodiversity conservation and things like global change adaptation and mitigation. So to start with your definition, when we think about ecological forestry, and again, this is certainly something that Ethan talks about a lot, both when I've been on woods walks with him and certainly in his writing. So I'm probably not the first person to talk to you about what guides our approach with ecological forestry, but really the central emphasis of ecological forestry is that we are using our understanding of natural forest systems. So systems where there's been minimal human impact, or that human impact has been largely from a kind of low impact extraction. So again, think of traditionally used by indigenous people, but not kind of this timber focused model where we're really kind of impacting that forest from a pretty dramatic sense. And so what we're trying to do is learn from, looking at places like this is in Williams Woods, not pristine old growth, but about as close as we come to a natural system for clay plain forests in Vermont. And we're examining and learning about the structure. And so again, I know I'm using a lot of forestry jargon here, but structure is just that, how are the sizes and distributions of trees, their spatial arrangement, living in dead wood, how much is there, what's its characteristics, how many layers are to the canopy, is it continuous, do we have a lot of vertical and horizontal heterogeneity out there? And so really looking at kind of how plants are arranged in that forest and trying to learn from that, with the underlying hypothesis that most of the native biodiversity in our region evolved in response to those structures. And so if we can emulate that to some degree, we will be providing their habitat needs. To that point, a lot of what we're also trying to do beyond emulating those structures is that we're trying to emulate some of those functions. And so I just mentioned habitat provisioning as one function, but other functions might be carbon storage or stability and nutrient cycling. And certainly some of the function is that we want above ground wood production. We're talking about using management to do these things. And so we want to make sure that forest is also certainly growing trees. And then the final piece that I'll talk quite a bit about is that we want to know a lot about the dynamics. And so how is that forest changing over time? And most importantly, how has that forest responded to disturbances, natural disturbances? Because that's really the key piece of information that a forester needs to understand if that ecosystem responded to that natural disturbance this way, how do I emulate those processes with my chainsaw and with that skidder and with that operation to try to emulate aspects of that process in a way that gives me these ecological outcomes. And so what's key about all of this is that we're doing it in a way that's trying to certainly meet economic objectives. So I'll remind you again in a minute, we are talking about cutting trees and using trees, again, helping boost our localvorism around wood. But we're doing it in a way that integrates a consideration of ecological outcomes as well as certainly social outcomes. And so trying to really factor in kind of a range of outcomes beyond just kind of what historically has maybe been an economic focus depending on the ecosystem and the region of the world. And so I'm going to do something that I often cringe a little bit about, and we kind of have this straw person comparison between ecological forestry and what we kind of label timber focused forestry. And this is from a recent textbook on ecological silviculture. And the main thing I want folks to remember is that we're still cutting trees. So ecological forestry, everything you're going to see today, we're talking about using management, ecological silviculture, with the goal being, to both remove trees to serve our local wood needs, but also to achieve some broader objectives. And so what this table really is meant to do, and these pictures, I have a photo here on the left from Quebec of an area being managed with ecological silviculture, and a pine plantation on the right from Florida that's amazingly only 12 years old, that's being managed really with what we call timber focused and really agronomic approach to forestry. And so when we talk about ecological forestry, the goal is certainly to grow trees that we have interest in from an economic standpoint, but really we're trying to maintain kind of the full array of structures and functions and species in an ecosystem. And so there's not this discrimination against a given species because it doesn't meet some sort of commercial goals. Whereas oftentimes in our timber focused model, we really are trying to simplify that system to the best of our ability. And we can do this not just a plantation. Think about even if I have a sugar bush and all I want is sugar maple in that stand, because that's going to meet my economic goals to the fullest. I might simplify that forest down to that species. So that's a pretty good analog to some degree for our landscape. Likewise, what we're talking a lot about today is we use this understanding of natural ecosystems to guide how we use silviculture and the trees we paint and kind of how we schedule harvesting. Whereas this type of approach is much more of agronomic. It's based on simplifying that system, making it very efficient to harvest, certainly putting a lot to the best of our ability, top-down control on the ecosystem so that we have some influence to the best of our ability of how those trees grow and how they're arranged in the landscape. And then related to that is this is a pretty homogeneous scenario on the right? This is very much focused on efficiency. It's just like why we don't plant corn in zigzags, right? It's a lot easier to harvest that and plant that if it's in rows. Same goes for trees. Whereas in ecosystem management and in more broadly ecological forestry, we're really trying to emulate that complexity. And then finally, our output is we want ecosystem diversity and resilience. We want to make sure that there's these emergent properties from our focus on heterogeneity in an ecological forestry model, whereas in a timber focused model, and again, if we want to think about a sugar bush, in some cases, we're trying to the best of our ability to maximize sugar maple health so as to not interrupt any output of that crop, right? So, whether it's forest tank caterpillar, we might actually spray that sugar bush to minimize impact. Same goes for a plantation. We're really trying to maximize the health of those trees and putting a lot of input in to minimize risk. So a very different approach. Whereas ecological forestry is certainly going to rely on the emergent properties of the system. So if we look at our landscape, and the map on the left is kind of a generalized version of the National Woodland Owner Survey and kind of what the Northeast looks like. The blue here it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. This is family forest, and so many of you on the webinar today certainly fall into that category. Individuals that own forest land. And as someone once said, Brett Butler, who works in the Family Forest Research Center, family forest owners rule. And what he means by that, both they're awesome people, but more importantly, they rule. They are the dominant landowner. In Vermont, over 70% of our forests are owned by family forest owners. On the green here, we have the public forest land, primarily both the Green Mountain National Forest, Great Forest Parks and Recreation, the Nolhegan Basin, Fish and Wildlife Service. And so we also have these public lands, and then what we call corporate forest land, and those are often owned by companies like Weyerhaeuser in Vermont, certainly other ownerships in places like Maine as well, Wagner and others. And so when we look at the state of Maine, it's quite a bit different. We have these large corporate ownerships. Certainly these are places where we often think of historically where there may have been a more timber-focused model relative to elsewhere. And so I'm going to get into talking a little bit about how folks have historically looked at ecological forestry, how it fits across the landscape. But before I get into that, I do want to return to a point that I mentioned earlier, in that we've lost forest land in Vermont for the first time in 100 years, in the last time they censused forest land. And so the first thing before we debate how forests get managed is that we want to keep forest. We know that there's no better terrestrial land cover than forest for carbon. And so that alone, we want to keep forest from a carbon perspective. And then again, forests are just amazing kind of backbone of all we do in Vermont, whether it's tourism or just the water and the air we have here. And so I'm going to talk about kind of a broad vision for kind of conserving forest land, and then get into kind of how ecological forestry fits into that. And so about 10 years ago, there was a discussion about, are there ways for us to kind of make sure that a lot of this family forest land is protected and really minimize the risk to conversion to other uses, development and other uses, and try to stem the tide on loss of forest. And this is not just a Vermont issue. Certainly for all 6 New England states have been losing forest land. And so 10 years ago, the Harvard Forest put forth, and again, I know some are familiar with this, what's known as wildlands and woodlands. And the name of that vision really speaks to kind of 2 broad elements that they were really hoping for across the landscape. And so the wildland piece are what we would consider kind of ecological reserves. These are areas that are permanently protected where no management can occur. And then the woodlands are areas where they have an easement on them, so that they no longer can be developed, but nevertheless, they can still be managed for a diversity of uses. And really their vision was that by the year 2070, 70% of all of the land in New England would have some form of protection on it, either as a permanent reserve or as a land with conservation easement on it. And their original vision was that 63% of that 70, so here's where would be in a woodland condition, and the remainder would be these unmanaged reserves. But I've updated this graph really to reflect what I'm sure some of you are aware of, is that with the Biden administration, there really is this push for by 2030, that 30% of a state or a region would be in these wildland reserves. And I'm translating it to those given, we're talking about GAP status 1 and 2 lands, so very, very high value, wild lands across the landscape. And so if we're able to achieve that, so 30% of Vermont is reserves, which I think all of us can get behind in terms of just the value of having unmanaged areas and what that means for us. Really, when we're thinking about those ecological forestry, a lot of that would fall in this woodland area where we kind of have, still the option to manage forests and manage them for multiple values, but we're trying to kind of balance that with ecological goals and so forth. And so when folks were first trying to sort out, where ecological forestry fit into the world, they had kind of thought about it in the context of, we want to have areas that we don't manage at all. We also want to have areas that we use to produce our wood, but we also want to have areas where there's space to do this kind of, at the time, new type of forestry that would be, I guess, kind of Ethan added it to my Tyler Knott, a kinder, gentler forest management in terms of what we might do out there. And so I always find it nice to reflect on this, because there's a lot of discussions right now, certainly in Vermont and elsewhere, as to how should our forests be managed, particularly in the name of carbon and so forth. But there's always been this vision for the region, this was written for Maine, of the value of having unmanaged areas for biodiversity purposes as just a natural benchmark to compare our management to. Are we losing things that are being found in these reserves? But also an acknowledgement that there are also going to need to be areas that produce wood for us, and so I would argue that Vermont, we kind of fall into this category here, right? We're basically, we have protected areas, and what we'll be talking about today is that a lot of what we do is some sort of shade of ecological forestry or new forestry. And so this is kind of the zone that we largely fit in as a state, and I guess Maine is where we can maybe get some of that high yield from. So you notice the term on there as new forestry. So 1992, they were calling this ecological forestry new forestry. And so I'm going to get into a little bit of the history of this, because I much to maybe your chagrin, I really like history and understanding where stuff comes from. But I think it's worth just reflecting on, particularly as you'll see, and I know at least a couple of folks are aware of it. It should give us all a little bit of Northeast pride in that this wasn't as new as some thought, but it's worth at least exploring where this idea of ecological forestry comes from. So if you were to kind of dig into kind of Western record of forest science, I would argue that ecological forestry had been occurring in Vermont for millennia by indigenous people across the region. Certainly kind of the original form of that. But when we think about it from a Western science perspective, and was first popularized kind of in forestry and kind of broader conservation biology. Really, a lot of folks point to the mid 1980s when the spotted owl wars were happening in the Pacific Northwest, and a real page turner of a document, this general technical report by the Forest Service, Douglas Fir Stand Management for the Future. There was this inconspicuous chapter called Modifying Douglas Fir Management Regimes for Non-Timber Objectives, and those that are familiar with that landscape, and even today, this is a picture from a couple of years ago just outside of Portland. What we talked about, that agronomic model. Again, a lot of our wood that we use in Vermont comes from, we have a lot of Douglas fir consumption in Vermont from these places. The idea of managing this for anything other than this high value timber product was pretty novel in 1986. And Jerry Franklin, who's really viewed as a visionary for this, kind of had this great quote in that general technical report that there are even fewer absolutes in ecology than in forestry, but an emerging operating maxim is simplification is really beneficial. And really what he's getting at again is that, this agricultural model of managing our forests was taking what we know is naturally a very complex system and simplifying it for a single output. And so you started seeing this term pop up in the late 80s called new forestry, kind of managing for kind of ecosystems and ecosystem attributes. But as I mentioned, that's not actually where the story begins in North America in terms of using this term of ecological forestry and using these ideas of managing for complex systems, but still certainly securing wood products from them. And actually where it comes from is from Massachusetts, from an Ivy League forestry school, not Yale, of course, in Connecticut, but there was another Ivy League forestry school in New England up through the 1930s and 40s, the Harvard Forest, part of Harvard University. And really, you know, a lot of the early work out of the Harvard Forest really spoke to various aspects of ecological forestry. And so if you look at kind of the literature on ecological forestry in North America, the first time that term is ever used is in Massachusetts and actually South Central New England, so including New Hampshire. And so Steve Spur and Alan Klein were successors to the original director of the Harvard Forest, Richard Fisher, here in the lower left. And in this document, they talked about that silvicultural treatment should follow nature as far as possible. And in practice, this maxim often has been forgotten or otherwise violated. So they're already recognizing, you know, in 1942 that there's this notion that maybe we should be working with the site, thinking about nature, and trying to emulate aspects of ecology in our forest practice. And the origin of that revelation really came from the career of Richard Fisher, who you see here with this very menacing looking machete, you know, cutting back oak. And what Fisher spent really his first couple decades of his career doing was battling back all of these pesky hardwoods that for some reason would not allow him to keep regrowing white pine on these old fields, right? And so you think about, you know, even Ethan was just talking about your new community forest, you know, that old field white pine obviously is there as a relic of land use. It's not really the natural expression of that site. But in the early teens in North America, and certainly they were inheriting it from the European training, you know, the idea was to really impose your will on that forest. And they wanted white pine. That was a species that they wanted to grow. And they spent a long time publishing lots of papers on how to kill everything to grow white pine before Fisher had this revelation that, you know, maybe I should be growing oak on these sites. Maybe I should be thinking about the ecology of those sites. And I think one of the more enjoyable quotes, and I know I have former silviculture students in there, so she's seen it before, that I really like is that they reflected on kind of how this all fit together based on some of their visits they've been making to these old growth stands. And then I'll talk about this place and those that have heard Charlie Cogbill speak before. Charlie talks about the Pisgah Forest as well. But in southwestern New Hampshire, Pisgah State Forest, prior to that becoming a state forest, it had the highest concentration of remaining old growth at the turn of the 20th century. And it's not that far from the Harvard Forest. And so Richard Fisher and others would go and look at these amazing pines, and it's not just the amazing pines, but the diversity of trees there, really just to see what it looked like. And this quote, I think, really nicely summarizes what they soon learned, particularly as when they would go back and try to battle back the hardwoods on the sites they were on, is that, you know, initially they wanted to see, you know, what virgin timber looked like, but as time went on, it became more and more evident that the soundest basis for the development of the art of silviculture lay in an understanding of the natural forests of the region. And so for some of you that are maybe first being exposed to even the notion of ecological forestry, you might be like, yeah, of course, that makes sense, that's what you should do. But if you look at what the emphasis was at that time over how we should be managing forests, and really continued to be up until the new forestry era, it was really all about, you know, top down, we need to control this system, and natural forests really were not a point of emphasis at all. So what the Pisgah Forest does is provide a nice example of what I'm going to go through for the second and final portion of this presentation are some of the main considerations that we use when it comes to ecological forestry. And again, for those that have been around forest management, kind of understand kind of the general approach, these are really meant to contrast with some of the ways that we've historically thought about, you know, cutting trees and managing forests. And so the first thing that's really different about ecological forestry relative to kind of a traditional timber-focused model is that, you know, one of the main operating provisions is that you're making as much emphasis on what's being left behind in that forest as you are of what's being removed. And so historically, we really focused on removals, right? How much volume is coming off, what species is out there, how much is it worth? And there was far less emphasis on, am I leaving behind large dead wood? Am I leaving behind large, you know, diameter trees? And so the idea of continuity is that we're really trying to emulate what we know is a really critical process in a forest in terms of its ability to recover, respond, and sustain processes following disturbance. And so the Pisgah Forest in New Hampshire was a great example of that. So in 1906, here's a photo of that old growth. Harvard Forest actually protected 25 acres of this old growth. And lucky for them, the 1938 hurricane decided to completely blow that down. So this is that same area after the 1938 hurricane. But wisely, they did not salvage that forest. They left it alone. And this is what that forest looks like on the right here, right? And so these logs, in 1938, these are some of the same logs, still providing structure, still providing habitat, carbon benefit. And likewise, these trees, the understory, this advanced regeneration of hemlock, these legacies are likely many of these trees that end up forming that canopy. And so when we think about how this forest recovered and how that forest carried biodiversity and carried process with it, it was a lot about that continuity between the pre-disturbance forest and the post-disturbance forest. And so in ecological forestry, what we're doing is, again, we can't leave everything behind, right? Again, we want to be locavore champions and use and produce our own wood and do it in a good way. But we're thinking about, yes, I'm harvesting some of those trees, but what am I leaving behind, and what are those legacies going to do in terms of function? And so what this has done really globally has kind of, and maybe sometimes in a bad way, made many people associate any type of forest management that leaves trees behind instead of taking them all as ecological forestry. I've retained trees, so I've done ecological forestry. And I would argue you're kind of a quarter of the way there. We have 3 more principles to talk about, but in general, yes, this doesn't seem like rocket science, but in many cases, leaving behind trees to live out their lifespan, leaving them behind thoughtfully in groups, or leaving behind trees that have tremendous wildlife value, or that in some cases have high economic value, but you're foregoing that for ecological purposes, is quite revolutionary relative to some of the ways we've traditionally looked at forests. But the idea is certainly to provide that future legacy and that future continuity with those individuals. And so terms that you'll often see folks talk about, and certainly Ethan talk about, leave trees, legacy trees, terms like green trees. The traditional way we would call these trees might be reserve trees. And it's created a whole new type of harvesting in places that they now call these retention harvests, where basically a big part of the focus is on what am I retaining on that site versus removing it. So certainly a major shift and major element of continuity. So each of these principles, and we'll go through 4 of them, I'll show kind of a snippet of this table just to kind of highlight some of the outcomes that are associated with each of these principles, both from a traditional standpoint. So if you're interested in, well, what does this get me in terms of wood production? There's a commodity production column. The main goal historically for a lot of these was biodiversity conservation. And then on the right-hand side, we'll have global change, resilience and adaptation, which is certainly something we care a lot about today as well. And so by leaving behind trees, certainly if we actually harvest some of those ultimately, there's the opportunity for larger wood. And so certainly higher value products, although there's also a risk involved. But a lot of what we think of in terms of continuity is, what is this providing us from a biodiversity standpoint? And so a term we often hear is lifeboating of species. And so what I mean by that, what a great group of species to lifeboat here. We have some yellow birch germinating on this log. And so if yellow birch, which it isn't, was unable to or not able to reproduce all of a sudden in this very open condition, by leaving behind this log and protecting this log, what I might be doing is kind of allowing that species to be carried into the new forest, right? So I'm kind of keeping that structure that it needs, kind of lifeboating it into that new forest system. And so we often think of leaving behind these mature structures as one way to do that. Likewise, one thing I think is critical about continuity is this idea of protecting advanced regeneration. And so this is a really great harvest I got to visit on the Green Mountain National Forest, where you have some examples of some awesome legacies in terms of dead wood, living trees. What they've also done with this harvest is really carefully protect any spruce regeneration in that stand, to really carry that legacy forth of that system that might take a bit to build up, and really is important for that complexity. And so bringing in some of those elements. Those that know me know I can't just gloss over dead wood. It's on a slide. So of course, we have to talk about dead wood and why it's so important. And so when we think of leaving behind living trees, really the goal there is to leave behind future dead trees, right? And the reason for that, both from the perspective of carbon benefits and hydrologic benefits, is certainly emphasized quite a bit. But something we don't fully appreciate as much in the US as they do in places like Scandinavia, that there are a ton of different species, particularly of what we call saprophilic species. And so what that term means, basically, those are species that require dead wood at one or all stages of their lives. So there's many beetles, certainly wood inhabiting fungi, pine marten, certain bat species we would all consider as saprophilic, and that they rely on dead wood. And all of these species, currently, if they go into Vermont's forest, for the most part, aren't too excited. We really are lacking that dead wood component that we know is much more common in natural systems. And what you're looking at here is even the function of these dead wood areas during the winter. These footprints, this marten, disappear when there's a log, and we call that a kind of subnivean passage, a below snow passage. They're basically going into this log and using that both for cover and denning, as well as actually for hunting, and so can be very important functionally as well in the winter. And so if we look at kind of dead wood in our forests of Vermont and elsewhere, what I have here on this graph is just kind of the amount of dead wood on the left, and then the amount of snags and basal area on the right. And then the x-axis, these are old growth forests on the left, and then second growth forests on the right. And the second growth forests haven't been managed. So these are forests very similar to what we have in a lot of places in Vermont. And then what I've also highlighted on here are stands that we manage, with good long-term traditional selection methods for northern hardwood systems. So generally what we see is we definitely have way more dead wood in old growth than we do in our second growth forests. And the forests that we manage are somewhat in between, but still not approaching what we see in old growth. And where the biggest differences exist are in standing dead trees. And in particular, stands that we manage very rarely have the same amount or abundance of snags as old growth and even second growth. And for second growth, it's because those often are very dense and you have a lot of self-thinning mortality happening in there. And the reason for that is that if I look at this picture here on the right, this tree is still alive. It's a great tree through my eye. But historically, a tree like this, low vigor, high risk, low value, was the first tree to be removed from a stand, right? This is a high priority tree to get out of that stand from a timber production standpoint. It's not, you're not very excited to be cutting it, but you're freeing up growing space for what we call acceptable growing stock. And so over time, when we do long-term management with that focus of just quality from a timber perspective, we often will actually strip out some of these really critical kind of future large cavity trees and snags across the landscape. And so the key take home here is that, we need more dead wood. This is a great piece of dead wood here, right? But if you look behind it, there's no, this is down in Washington, Vermont. There's no dead wood like this at all in the forest, and all the living trees that are left out there are not close to the size of this tree. So it's gonna be a long time before we get another big log like this on the site. And so keep thinking about how can I get more dead wood into my forest? So be a horticulturist as well as a silviculturist is my take home today. So the second principle, is probably the one that most associate with ecological forestry and assume kind of is ecological forestry. And it's certainly a key piece of this. But the term complexity, we hear it over and over again. And when we were first thinking about ecological forestry and kind of writing broad recommendations for this, I'd argue to also include diversity in this. And the reason for that is this speaks to the origin of the new forestry methods being from the Pacific Northwest, where it really was just taking a single species Douglas fir forest and just creating some complex structure in it, and that's, so it's just different flavors of Douglas fir, structural complexity. But in our forest, they're extremely mixed. And so structure is great, but we want to make sure we also have desirable composition as well, right? And that we're kind of getting that mix of structure and diversity that we know exists across our landscape. And so this principle really gets at a lot of what, again, Ethan talks about, and he paid me to reinforce all of his messages to you, that when we're doing management, we are deliberately trying to create structural complexity. So again, diversity of tree sizes, diversity of dead wood conditions, horizontal and vertical complexity. And we're doing it at multiple spatial scales. So certainly here we're looking at less than an acre, and that we're doing that kind of nested across this landscape, that this mosaic of conditions, including things that emulate tip-up mounds, large trees, all of those elements that we know are quite important on the landscape. One thing that I think is an important caveat, and again, Charlie Cogbill, I'm channeling my inner Charlie Cogbill today, will often point to this, that when we think about natural systems and old growth, we often emphasize where the pictures are taken, right? I'm just as guilty, my students measuring this big white pine, that's the picture we took, not in this mess of a blowdown that was, a couple feet away from it. And so when we're looking at complexity and kind of across that landscape, we need to recognize that yes, big old trees are part of that complexity, but we want to really capture that there's a tremendous amount of variation within natural stands where you might have gaps or areas where you don't have perfect infilling. Think of our seepage forest where it won't be a fully stocked condition potentially ever. And again, to highlight that, this is just showing you basal area values going across a transect through an old growth forest. And what you're seeing here is that there's some basal area values, those that know how to interpret these, that are approaching like Douglas fir old growth levels in the Pacific Northwest. But there's other areas that there's not very many trees at all. And so really reflecting that fine scale spatial variation, including where this person is getting their picture taken in an old growth stand, but you notice they're not too happy because they're not surrounded by the big trees, right? They're surrounded by where there was a recent gap. And so that complexity is pretty important to think through. So when we think about this complexity principle, oftentimes this is where, and I saw it it's in the description of the presentation, natural disturbance-based silviculture and kind of how do we emulate natural disturbances. And so in Vermont, when we think of our natural disturbance regime, which is primarily dominated by wind and ice and insects and diseases, let's hope we get the rain tonight so we have to stop having to think about fire for another few months. But generally, we're thinking every 10 years, 5 to 20% of the canopy is being disturbed by these wind events that are pretty fine scale. But we also have these what we call downbursts and mesoscale events that might disturb 30 to 60% of an area. And those are a little bit less frequent, can sometimes be fairly frequent, but generally we think of every 60 to 300 years, we get these more kind of punctuated events that also hit the landscape. And so what that does and had done historically is really create this complexity, both in structure across the landscape, but also in terms of composition, providing those niches for less tolerant tree species that might need more disturbed habitat, as well as certainly creating these complex old conditions across the landscape. And so when we think about complexity, and I have a couple pictures here, one from Quebec again, this is a continuous cover, a regular shelterwood, and you can just see that complexity across this forest. It's being managed, but we have open areas, we have kind of lightly thinned areas, we have dense areas, a lot of heterogeneity in the structure there. That complexity really is providing what we call a very niche-rich space. A lot of opportunities for different species to exist. Likewise, this is some work that Nancy Patch is doing, with the regular shelterwoods as well. We're seeing kind of a diversity of structures and heights and species, all in a fairly short distance, and that's all being created by the paint gun, right? Foresters kind of introducing that into this area through ecological silviculture. And so when we think of this from a global change, resilience, and adaptation perspective, having that heterogeneity and complexity and all of those different processes out there is very consistent with a lot of what we think about in terms of what might make a forest more resilient to a disturbance or a drought or some of these other stressors out there. And so that this principle really meshes very well with those ideas. And ironically, or not, coincidentally, I don't think so, a lot of the recommendations when we look at the silviculture with birds in mind, that Vermont Audubon and Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation produced and is now in over 20 states, the majority of the prescriptions in that guide really fall into these ecological forestry categories, trying to introduce that both fine scale, but also multi-scale complexity, where we have this vertical and horizontal heterogeneity, gaps, and then dense canopy areas, and using an understanding of the development of those systems and trying to accelerate that complexity. I'll also argue that besides lacking complex old forests, we also lack complex young forests. And oftentimes when people talk about young forests, we picture just large clear cut with nothing in it, and that might not be something that has a natural analog to it. What I'm talking about are forests where we still have some trees left behind, emulating what would have occurred with a pretty severe wind event, and that still provides a lot of the functions that we need for those early successional birds. And this is a recent paper that just came out looking at shrubland bird responses to tree retention from a faculty member, Michael Acrish at Antioch College, as well as Dave King's group with the Forest Service. And so if we take chestnut-sided warbler, here's a photo, not taken by me because I just ogle over birch, yellow birch especially. What we're looking at here is as we increase the amount of trees retained, right, percentage retained, we can see that this line does go down, right? This is an open shrubland bird species. It's not going to be happy in a closed canopy forest. But what I think is really telling and useful from this work is that you notice there's all of these species, whether it's gray catbird, indigo bunting, mourning warbler, they all seem to do fairly well, even with a moderate level of retention. So when we think about creating young forest habitat, we still want to integrate things like complexity and continuity into those ecosystems to provide kind of those multiple functions out there. All right, we're halfway through the principles, not through the talk, don't worry, we're getting there. So in terms of the second to last principle is this idea of timing. And this gets back to my earlier comments about the age of our forests in Vermont. And this principle really was thought of more in the context of places like Oregon, where they manage forests on what we call short rotations. So they're often harvesting those trees at age 50 or 60 or sometimes even age 30, based on some economic criteria that really prevents those forests from getting to an older stage. But in our forests, really what we're battling against is not like too much timber harvesting. We've already established that earlier. What we're dealing with, again, is this historic legacy of land use where it's really hard, and again, Liz and others can speak much better to this, to find old forests or even old forest conditions across our landscape. And as we all know, it doesn't take rocket science, it takes a long time, right? It takes decades to hundreds of years to get old trees. And so what timing really gets at is that we are leaving and making sure that we have provisions for trees to get old and trees to die and to live out their lifespan and to develop that complexity in the landscape. We still are harvesting trees, but we're trying to kind of allow for and include in our management deliberate provisions that acknowledge that our time frame, which is often being driven by, I don't want to leave that tree out there much longer. It's already, veneer grade. What's the risk of 10 more years? That we kind of we relinquish those fears a bit and actually leave things behind and allow them to get big and ultimately die and provide that structure. And so this timing principle really gets at, from a biodiversity standpoint, again, not the flashiest organisms in the world, but cryptograms and mosses and lichens and that have very slow generation times. And once they're established, it's great, they're established, but it takes a long time to get them there. And then once they're there, they're not going to disperse across the landscape, like a birch. They really, it takes a long time for them to reestablish in places. And so leaving behind trees to get old, making sure that we're allowing them to live out their lifespan is quite critical. And again, to return back to my friend, the red spruce, allowing some of these trees to mature and become a seed source that then allows us to start building up this regeneration and returning some of those elements to our forests that historically were quite important that have been selectively removed. And of course, we all like the big trees. I guess I'm getting back into that trap of pictures of people only next to big trees, but it takes time to grow this yellow birch. And so providing opportunities for that. And what's critical about this, those that are familiar with discussions around carbon, these big trees have such a disproportionate impact on how much carbon is in the forest. And so having provisions for leaving those trees behind is critical, while at the same time recognizing that forests full of big trees everywhere was never the norm. And so we can't use that as our benchmark for how we strive going forward in terms of our future forest conditions in the region. And to that point, just a quick comment on carbon, because it's important to bring up as we're thinking about leaving things behind in reserves. The first couple of principles I've talked about, this idea of continuity, and then also this idea of timing, really are excellent principles for allowing trees to get old, allowing dead wood to accrue on a site, and really providing kind of high levels of storage, right? And this clock here, this brown, is just showing going up with age as we go clockwise. As forests age, it's a well-established fact that the amount of carbon out there increases. So the older the forest, the more carbon there is out there. There's really irrefutable science on that. At the same time, if we follow this green diagram, this is sequestration, so the rate at which carbon is being pulled from the atmosphere. It's also been proven by hundreds of papers, although often misconstrued, but proven by hundreds of papers. And once again, recently, that as forests age, they kind of peak in their rate of carbon uptake, usually between age 30 and 70. They still sequester carbon as they get older, but at a lower rate than when they're younger. And so by having that complexity of forest conditions across the landscape, that certainly includes patches of younger trees, mixed with areas where we have older trees, we really provide this balance that both storage is occurring, but we're also maintaining high levels of sequestration so that Vermont can still have a strong forest carbon sink over time, not just thinking about kind of accrual. So the final piece, we're almost there, is context. And this one, really is not unique to ecological forestry. Conservation biology in general, it's kind of amazing to think that 1986 is when many first view landscape ecology being codified as a discipline. So it's not that new, but at this point, I think many of us recognize the importance of thinking about landscapes when we're planning anything in conservation, whether it's where the next community forest might be, or kind of how do I harvest across the landscape. And again, in the context of our our disturbances and our natural systems, we know that even in a severe disturbance that we're looking at here, this happens to be down in Brimfield in a tornado event, we have these highly impacted areas, but also areas not being impacted adjacent to it, and then areas that were lightly impacted a little bit further away. And so if I look at this through the lens of a chestnut-sided warbler, there's certainly a couple places where there might actually be some interaction between those patches, other areas that might not be as suitable, but I need to factor in kind of how the arrangement of these different conditions across the landscape might influence the overall function of that forest. If I contrast that with a view that I could sneak out at Robbins Mountain, kind of the one lone harvest in a sea of no harvest, this is certainly providing a lot of opportunity at a very local scale. But the functionality of this, kind of the ability of there to be interaction between species and pollinators that are using this, dispersal of propagules, really that's kind of an isolated element without much connection to what's happening around it. So context is really trying to think about what you're doing today, how it intersects with your neighbor, and what that might mean over time in terms of the overall function of your landscape. And so again, really trying to think through kind of how those operate across the system. And I'm going to skip through to one final slide before I conclude here, so I have time for questions. So thankfully, Liz is on here, so if there's any questions about Vermont conservation design, she can take it. But we already have some great folks like Liz Thompson of Vermont Land Trust, and certainly Forest Parks and Recreation and Fish and Wildlife, looking at ways at the kind of landscape scale of how do we look at context and how our landscapes fit together and how we might manage them going forward. But really, because our landscape is so homogeneous in terms of conditions, but complex in terms of ownership, this is a really hard principle for us to think through in Vermont, unless we're really willing to be more coordinated across ownerships and thinking about how the management we do in one area might enhance biodiversity and functioning elsewhere. And so Cold Auto Canada certainly has some programs that happen there that Nancy Patch is heavily involved with, that are thinking about how woodlands are interacting across that landscape and providing those functions. So final slide here. So as our friend Richard Fisher showed with the machete, working against a site is not a good idea. We want to be working with the ecology of the site. And what's important about that is anything we do in forest stewardship needs to be localized. And I mean localized to the square 25 acres that you're working in. And I think a real problem with ecological forestry when it first was revamped in the 90s and 2000s is people took ideas from Douglas fir and tried to apply it to other areas. Well, Douglas fir is a very different ecosystem than northern hardwoods. We want to make sure we're localizing it and making it work with our ecosystems and kind of our dynamics. One very important caveat, now here's a piece of equipment. So again, Ethan called this kinder and gentler, but for some of you, it still might seem mean and rough. There are going to be cut stumps and trees removed, but just keep thinking about that local vor belt, what that will mean when we can gain that for our wood production. And also really, this is a tool for enhancing and maintaining and restoring complex conditions. And so, we can certainly wait centuries for that. But there's also an opportunity to accelerate those processes and let them occur here. And to that point, waiting centuries, there's often a criticism that this is based on natural systems. What's the relevance now that everything's changed? And I already kind of pointed out there's a lot of elements of ecological forestry that jive really nicely with how we think about what will be adaptable to future conditions, as well as certainly what will be beneficial from a carbon storage perspective. So at least from my standpoint, and as long as Ethan keeps preaching the word of ecological silviculture, it's not going anywhere soon. But there's a lot of reasons why this is certainly a valid concept, and one could argue one that Leopold and others have been arguing for almost a century now. All right, I will stop there and certainly take questions, and apologize a little longer than I thought, but I get excited once I start talking about dead wood, so apologies.
Thank you so much, Tony. That was incredibly informative, and you covered a lot there, everything from history and science and some policy. And I know I personally really appreciate that you brought in the consumer piece as well, because we are all consumers. And, I'm one of those people who tries to be a locavore when it comes to my food and not purchase food from industrial or factory farms. And this is a reminder of how important it is when it comes to wood products as well. It's maybe not quite as easy. It's maybe harder to find them, but do you have any thoughts on any certifications that might be out there, or how people can try to source local wood products?
I think that's the real challenge is that it's hard to find, and I've found myself, I always value Vermont wood over certified wood. You know, if I can find it, you know, as much as green certification, you know, those are exciting things to me. That it's coming locally, you know, even from the carbon perspective, I'm excited about. But I do think we need to be looking more closely at it and really evaluating, you know, what it means. And it's amazing. I feel so fortunate to live here, especially when last fall you look at the West and the fire, like how many states had fire and are looking at, like, can we even grow trees in some of these places ever again? And I'm not saying I want Vermont to be a tree farm at all, but we sometimes take for granted how lucky we are to live in a place where trees grow largely readily. It's just the wrong stretch of weather to be talking about it because I'm kind of worried right now, but some this is a blip. And so, you know, we have the, you know, we have the, you know, the soils and the climate conditions and the species that, you know, really are internationally valued beyond locally valued, like maple. And so I think there needs to be some strategic visioning. And I think my biggest push right now is that those of you that are paying attention to, you know, Green New Deals and discussions about kind of the jobs plans and kind of infrastructure plans, you know, one big piece of that is affordable housing and green affordable housing, whether that's in Burlington or Boston or Worcester or you know, Brooklyn. And, you know, there's a really amazing green building material called mass timber that if we could just connect the dots, that there's a local supply of this, you know, of wood that coming from a place like Vermont, that we can do ecological forestry, and we can produce this material that's, you know, from a carbon standpoint, you know, kind of offsets steel's carbon footprint, you know, by 10 times. It's really a carbon friendly building material. Now we can both kind of deal with some of these issues with shortage of affordable housing, while at the same time using this green building material and really kind of connect kind of the rural to urban, you know, well-being, you know, because our rural areas that historically relied on those markets are dying too, you know, and so trying to really understand how that plays out across the region. And so, you know, those that have an ear of a senator that gets excited about that stuff, but doesn't quite think about, like, how about my rural forested areas of Vermont? How do they connect to this deal? Or rural parts of New Hampshire or parts of Maine? I think there's a real opportunity there to think about local production of even those products. I realize that's not going to go into your home, but just kind of providing that opportunity to connect a bit more to where people live and human well-being. Because I think it's very easy to detach ourselves from our consumerism, particularly now that so much comes from plantations. It's so far out of our vision, you know. So there are some great initiatives, you know, around local wood and you know, and trying to kind of have folks aware of that, and certainly the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund and other initiatives. But I think we need to be making more connections across multiple sectors as to why there's a global carbon benefit of using local wood and also a human well-being benefit of using that wood in our region. But when I go into areas and you want to buy local wood, it's not like food where you have almost 75% are from a farm within, you know, 10 miles. It's like, well, there's one place that might be from Vermont, you know. So I think we also need to focus a bit on when we look at, you know, wood manufacturing in the state, and how do we view that as an industry. And we already have actually the same amount of sawmills in Vermont as from Massachusetts, which is kind of odd, you know, given we think culturally our states are a bit different. So, you know, how do we feel about those types of industries in our state as well? So it's not a simple solution. But one last comment on that: the Amazon packaging that all of you have been feeling guilty about, I hope, was largely coming from you know, the Southeast. They were very excited for our rabid appetite for cardboard the past year. But now there's a mill in Maine that Chinese conglomerate Nine Dragons purchased that also produces packaging. So we're getting a little closer to where the source comes from in terms of that use. But still, you know, it's pretty amazing like how much we use every day that's coming from all over the place, and we don't quite have a sense for the impact.
Absolutely. And it seems like as consumers, we can, I think this partly happened with food, you know, put a little pressure on the hardware stores or the places where you go to buy your products, and ask questions. Where is it coming from? And this is what I'm looking for, and all that kind of thing. So
Agreed.
Love to take some questions from folks. So feel free to raise your hand, or you can also put a star in the chat or ask a question in the chat. Love to hear from some other folks about what questions you all may have for Tony. I know he covered a lot. So, okay, Liz, you had your hand up first.
This is a correction, not a question.
Could be a comment, but go ahead, Liz.
Tony, that was a great, great talk. I learned a ton. Thank you so much. I really did. You only like very briefly mentioned, well, Ethan mentioned the book. I just want to like do a little show and tell. Ecological Silviculture, the book
Thanks,
that you partially authored, is really an amazing resource. The question I have is actually I was interested in your slide of the wildlands and woodlands goal and your addition of the 30 by 30 goal. And I guess I've been really sort of out of touch with that process and what is going on with it and what the federal government is doing. But, do you know where they are in terms of like, so the question has been ever since we've heard about that is, what does that mean? What does that 30 mean? Does it mean like full preservation? Does it mean, what does conservation in the 30 by 30 mean to you?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, I think most people are familiar with this, but 30 by 30 is 30% of the landscape conserved by 2030. And so Liz's question really gets to that. What does conservation mean? And from what I can tell, Liz, digging into what qualifies for the lands they're targeting, their GAP 1 and GAP 2 status lands, which to me really correspond to lands where you would not manage. Definitely, it's just amazing. Like the creme de la creme, right, of what we have for natural and semi-natural landscapes. And I'm not sure, to your point, what the mechanism will be from a funding perspective to put the conservation on those lands, and whether it's because if we look at public land, public land's 11% of Vermont, so we couldn't just say, well, let's just flip. And I don't agree with us flipping all the public land to it already is conserved, so flipping it to a unmanaged state. And so you would need, similar to what occurred in the late 90s and the early 2000s, a lot of cost share assistance for easements, and so I guess I'm not sure the details on that, Liz, but there may be another time period which would be fantastic for these large easements, which I didn't mention it, but again, I think most folks recognize that we're facing a pretty frightening period in terms of the high likelihood, and again, all of it, of intergenerational transfer occurring. A lot of our family forest owners are, as we all know, like 65 and above, and so being able to conserve that land and get an easement on that land before that land transfers hands, so that it can still certainly be managed and other things can happen. And again, many of you are familiar with this, but we extinguish the development right on it. It's just a huge step towards that goal. But Liz, I'm not sure. I should dig into it a bit myself, but I also have heard enough in different channels in the federal government, Department of Interior and others, that there's clearly some. It's not just being said. I think there's definitely some momentum behind it occurring, and I think our landscape will be probably the most complicated one to figure it out in. Right? I think it's a lot easier in the big Western states where you already have 46% public land in some of those states. So yeah, good question. I'll have to figure it out.
The next person with their hand up was Jeff, and then I'll do one more person who has their hand up, and then we'll get to some questions in the chat. So Jeff Forward, you're up next.
Ethan has been talking about you, Tony, for quite some time, and now I understand why. This was really a stimulating and interesting presentation. I thank you for it. One of the things that I've been juiced about for quite some time is this mass timber concept. Mass timber is amazing. What can be done with small diameter wood, in skyscrapers, high-rise buildings. This is really, I've seen some of it in Austria. The spans that they can reach, across a gymnasium with mass timber rivals anything that steel can do, and it's just amazing. Do you know of any mill that's doing this in Vermont or anywhere close to Vermont that is doing this?
Maine is so, and that's one of the things too. I mean, obviously Maine already had a lot of the infrastructure to retrofit some of those mills. And so ironically, in Millinocket, many of you know, they used to have 3 paper mills, and now at 0. One of those has been turned into a biochar facility, so that's kind of interesting. And then the other, they're kind of shifting over to manufacture mass timber. And I totally agree with you. I mean, I think the museum in St. John is a Fairbanks Museum. I think there's going to be mass timber used for some work there. And I know there's some beautiful buildings on the UMass campus that are made from it. And there is a project that the Forest Service funded in a wood initiative grant that's happening in New Haven in the Hopewell Hicks neighborhood that's producing a 70-unit low-income housing with mass timber. And there's a pretty nice analysis of the carbon benefits and just kind of the overall benefits. The biggest challenge for that is, the wood's coming from probably Oregon. So it's, we haven't quite figured out how to your point, kind of localize that production so that the carbon footprint, even of the transport, is low. But it's clear, particularly in Europe, but also in the Northwest and into British Columbia, that they're really forging ahead with mass timber. And so the question, so it's mass MASS, and it's basically a manufactured wood product where they glue together just pieces of wood, and it's structurally as strong as steel, but it doesn't. So when it burns, it actually maintains its integrity, where steel ultimately it just chars on the outside like a log, but still maintains its structural integrity, where steel actually ultimately will melt. So even from a safety perspective, is a bit safer. And so the original concerns were the height of the buildings you could construct with it, but now they've kind of at least in some places approved skyscrapers, or 10 to 12 story, and then ultimately larger buildings. But there's a lot of folks that look at that as an opportunity for really, offsetting, some of our carbon footprint by putting more wood into that long-lived wood product.
Thanks for describing what that was,
Yeah.
Tony. And actually, since you mentioned Maine, let's take this question from Deborah in the chat. She says, I was shocked about all the corporate forests in Maine, and are they owned by American companies? What do you know about that?
Yeah, and my dog is getting excited about this one too. Maine is the most forested state percentage-wise, and it's ironically it's actually has the most privately owned forest land by corporations. It's kind of a very unique state, as we all know in many ways if you read any Stephen King. But the corporations, so some of those are based in Tacoma, so Weyerhaeuser, Wagner's, kind of more locally housed. There are Seven Islands, which is a company that's based in Maine. Historically, like South African Pulp and Paper owned land. So certainly, but most of these are what we call, either real estate investment trusts, and so they own the land both as a asset for timber, but also for real estate, or what we call timberland investment management organizations. So they own it primarily for the rest of, so like John Hancock owns a ton of land for their investors. And so it really has changed, and Liz is certainly familiar with a lot of this as well, but we think of the Champion land that used to exist in the Northeast Kingdom. That was owned by Champion Paper Company. They owned the wood, they sent it to their mills, and it was what we call vertically integrated. And really beginning in the kind of the 80s, the tax structure changed for those companies that kind of forced them to divest their forest land. And so we have owners from all over the world that often have some stake in these lands. And then these companies own lands around the world. So, they're not all Maine-based companies, and not all of them are looking to sell wood to like a specific mill. They're looking to make kind of revenue the best way they can, including some of them are looking at carbon as one source of revenue. But yeah, it's a big part of that northern Maine landscape. And where, like I said, the other end of the equity spectrum is there's some very distressed counties up there where folks, just like we have in Vermont, where the forest dependent communities that those jobs are certainly down. And so thinking of how do we take mass timber and connect them to other areas where they're struggling in the region with this affordable green housing, I think would be a great way to bridge that, the two corners of equity issues in the Northeast.
Maria had a question. Go ahead, Maria.
Hi, yes. My question is, how do the goals of ecological forestry jive with the state of Vermont's current use program?
So they're very consistent, with it, and I think we're certainly seeing some evolution over time into some various ways that it could fit even further. I think there's certainly discussions around kind of old forests and how that fits in that are still really in their nascent stages. That but there's certainly even room there depending on how you want to manage things. But ecological silviculture, ecological forestry, you are removing, you are harvesting and you're doing stewardship, and many of our consultants and I know certainly do this type of work. I think one of the challenges in some respects is that even though I was telling you it's not that new, in some cases it's different than like doing traditional northern hardwood silviculture, where you have this guide that I highly respect and is really well vetted, and so you might have a forester that's working with you and wants to do ecological silviculture. There's less of kind of a template, which is good. You want some creativity and flexibility, but in terms of being able to ensure that good sustainable management is still occurring, as they often will do when inspecting plans, you're typically looking for what guide did you use and kind of how did you determine what you were interested in. And so one thing that actually Liz and I have talked about is, well, a lot of those guides tell you you should only grow trees to a certain diameter and then you're supposed to cut them. Well, as I've said, we need to be letting some trees just grow. I mean, we just do not have much for big trees in the landscape. And so finding ways to communicate, with, don't worry about your county forester, but maybe other county foresters that, it is acceptable if the goal of the landowner is for some of these ecological objectives that they retain a proportion of that stocking in trees that are just going to live out their lifespan on a site. So it's a long-winded way of saying it's consistent. I just think that depending on kind of, how the plan's written, there might need to be enough kind of justification for why things are done a certain way so that someone like Ethan can evaluate it and make sure that it is good sound management and not just somebody saying I'm doing ecological forestry, but it ends up not coming out kind of with the intent that you wanted.
Thank you. I think Eleanor was next, and I'm going to read her question from the chat. She said, recently the logger working on my land had a difficult time finding a mill for poplar, oak, but not pine. So how can we be more locavore without local mills? The poplar went to Canada and the oak went to New Hampshire.
Yeah, I think that's a real challenge, and kind of how we, and the way that Canada certainly does it is the reason why they're so competitive to some degree is they subsidize their industry quite a bit because it's a big part of their fabric and their economy. And so the reason why, if you want to see the latest technology and how to mill wood, you go north because they're buying it and it's really kind of makes it hard to compete with kind of the international markets. And we're a small state, and again, Vermont is what it is in terms of the industries we have here. And so, I recognize that tomorrow there's not going to be a big mill that shows up in any town. But I think we do have some opportunities to both provide, those mills some maybe leeway as it relates to kind of how I think like with Act 250, one of the biggest challenges some of these mills have now is that we've lost 4 to 6 weeks from our winter and maybe this year even more. And that's when most of the wood's being, moved and most things are being hauled. And so many of these mills, when they can mill wood and get wood, they want to run, as much as they can to take advantage of those good times. And so there was actually some discussion of amending kind of the language in Act 250 to have kind of a provision for wood processing facilities to allow them to actually, it's not like a Walmart getting shipments of hand sanitizer in the middle of the night and disturbing people. This is really trying to keep that mill going and allowing the process when they can. And so at least just finding ways to keep some of those industries more profitable in the state. And then I know Sam Lincoln's done some work with our loggers and trying to certainly make it easy for them to, survive in the state, because it's not an easy task. But I think one of the challenges is just, to your point, we have limited manufacturing capacity already. All those species could have found a home in Vermont, but in general, I think, the challenge is that we have other larger producers that can kind of outbid or that they're sourcing from multiple places. And so you can't always keep it in the state, but when you consume in the state, you can still kind of hope that wood that you're consuming might not be the wood from your land, but that it was, milled somewhere, harvested somewhere in Vermont and milled somewhere in Vermont. But we export at least 35% of our wood out of the state to be processed and then bring it back in. So again, thinking of the carbon footprint of that. So there's a lot there that we need to work on, I think, in terms of our our natural climate solutions and how that our use of wood impacts our carbon footprint.
All right, Andrew, you were next with your hand up. Go ahead, Andrew.
Thanks, Tony. I think this question is going to be aimed at you, but Ethan could also answer because I think it goes in his direction and it relates to what you're just talking about in terms of loggers. So, I mean, there are lots of challenges I could ask you about in terms of like, you know, how is this system dealing with beach sprouts, or how is this system dealing with deer browse, or right? There's like, but the challenge I wanted to talk about was loggers, and obviously it's a very challenging profession, and we have a problem with the age of our loggers and the types of equipment that are sort of still available to be used. You know, larger equipment's becoming more common, smaller equipment's hard to find, but it seems like it's hard to sell many jobs as it is because we've got sort of large areas of this low quality second growth. And loggers are incredibly scrappy about their economics, right? They seem to be geniuses. You were talking about competitive markets and, you know, like, what's it going to cost me to truck this oak to New Hampshire? And can I balance that with a better price? And they store wood, they ship wood, they seem to get I almost want to say it's like the old adage about getting, you know, using every part of the deer, or loggers are pretty good about getting every dollar you can out of something. And so this comes back to a question about like, how do you sort of justify or convince a logger that pallet grade hardwood is something that you want to have left in place? Or even, I guess, a secondary question is, what's the value of leaving something like that in place to grow old versus trying to get a logger to fell it and leave it as large downed wood? And how do you both, because I know that you have experiments of this type, you know, like, how do you convince loggers to do that? And then where's the balance between standing dead wood and down dead wood?
Yeah, and I guess the broader comment, I really appreciate just how you describe loggers, because I think it's an amazing profession and all they do, and I think sometimes it gets kind of just lumped into, you know, they're out there to cut wood, and I just, it's what they're able to do, and yeah, the economics that are going, their efficiencies and just, I also understand why many don't want to stay in that. It's a rough profession, and so I guess I'll start with your last question first in terms of the, you know, felling lower grade material. It's ironic, you know, we had a special session a couple of years ago at the New England SAF meeting about dead wood because people were saying, well, there's no low grade market, so maybe people are going to start felling, just leaving the wood out there. And so it was like, yeah, that'd be kind of a nice side effect. But again, there's a cost, right, to even fell those trees. And also, you know, I've definitely come around a bit on if they don't want to fell it, you know, and it's not interfering with regeneration. So if you're not on a site where you have beach and you're afraid to leave shade, you know, allowing that tree to live out its lifespan, you know, because what we found sometimes when we girdle trees and try to create snags is that the cavity nesters don't have much interest in them. They really, you know, a cavity tree forms a cavity and then becomes a tree that they go after. And so like artificially created snags. But when we deliberately fell logs, I mean, it definitely works and functions like a log that would fall in the forest. And so, you know, I think there is that cost factor for the logger, and in my perspective on doing some of this work, like any job, is that you need to, evaluate kind of those trade-offs. And if you want to go full bore ecological forestry with extremely limited extraction, particularly of high value wood, then it's a small parcel. You almost would have to be willing to pay, you know, or you know, to have that, you know, there's kind of this gradient there, you know, where if you do have a stand with enough quality to carry the sale, and so maybe 40% or more acceptable growing stock, then you can get a bit more creative with what you're trying to do. But even when you look at the silviculture for birds, I always find it fascinating because the first ones they talk about, you know, these are stands that have really good residual growing stock, you know, and then you get to the last one, it's like, no, we're going to do a pretty, you know, will be pretty intensive by some people's eyes, you know, more, you know, kind of lower density shelter wood type approach, where, you know, they're moving more volume off there. So I think the economic piece is so important in this. And at the same time, your question points out that the economics is also an opportunity for maybe leaving some things behind it before we would like have markets for all of that. You know, with mass timber, that could change again, right? Where we actually are thinking, particularly, it looks like that they're most excited about softwoods for that. But anyhow, I think the economic piece is always going to be the main criteria. And so in other parts of the world with certification, particularly in the European Union, that really made these practices almost like the cost of doing business. You know, if you're going to be managing an area, you're going to leave things behind, and that kind of became an accepted standard. And I think for us, you know, unless there's a premium put on, or even some cost shared assistance, I mean, they're paying people to cut trees and drop them into streams. It'd be nice, you know, maybe there's opportunities as well to start thinking more broadly about some of those. And they're paying people to kill beech. You know, if there's the ways to kind of roll some of those as well into these types of treatments, particularly at a time where it's hard to, you know, get folks to do them. So even being able to use some of those payments to keep loggers going in those time periods would be helpful. But I definitely don't belittle the economic side of it, especially right now. But one thing through all this, and all of you that work with loggers know, it's clearly communicating, you know, what the intent is, and kind of what, and finding out like what do they feel is the most effective way to achieve some of those objectives. Because I've always been surprised with what I think, oh, this would be the way to fell these trees and kind of create this retention and mark it out. And then, you know, my idea is abandoned in about 2 minutes, you know, when they figure it out. So I think with anything in what you're trying to achieve on the land base, especially if it's a deviation from a norm, you know, ask the people that think it through the lens of something that's, you know, got a 30-foot berth to it. And, you know, it's you know, pretty amazing what they can come up with, even with big equipment on the right site.
Okay, I think we'll do one last question. Jeff, I see you have your hand up, and I see Aaron just put his hand up, and then we'll kind of wrap up. But if some folks want to stay on, Tony, are you willing to stay on past 8:30? Okay. So I'll ask this last question, we'll wrap it up, and then if folks want to stay on for additional questions, we can do that. We'll give folks a chance to go do whatever's next on their agenda. So this is from Tom. He says, do root sucker thickets of beech, and for that matter, stump sprouts of ash, have a role in adding complexity to a forest or serving as a genetic legacy? And I'd love to add to that a question that I've had, which is a little bit separate, but a little bit different, but similar about the complexity piece. I wonder if you or others have looked at any mycorrhizal networks and fungal networks and thought about how those might change with you know, impacts of forestry, and if scientists are starting to look more closely at that as we learn more about how important they are in forests.
Yeah, so to that first point, the beech I'm not worried about as much. I mean, I think we want to, you know, if we see resistant individuals, you know, try to maintain those individuals in the stand. But the ash, you know, some know I'm a pretty big proponent of. If you can recruit a new ash, do it. You know, provide that future opportunity. You know, who knows what's going to happen in the landscape, and that, you know, the reason why I guess I'm splitting those two is, one is beech is going to be, you know, it's an amazing tree for all the wrong reasons, but it's an amazing tree, but it's also a challenging tree if you want other species to grow. And so in terms of its ability to withstand future changes, and I mean, it's going to be out there, obviously, not as the tree it was 200 years ago, but we're going to have it out there in vegetative material. And so I think where we can identify if there's a resistant tree, or even with legacy retention, you know, when we see trees with bear activity, you know, those are trees, you know, as you know, not every beech is used by a bear. You know, there's certain beech that are, and there's a reason for it. And so those are trees you want to be like maintaining on the site and buffering on the site and keeping as part of that forest. But with ash, you know, people are cutting ash, and I understand why. And so my argument is always, we'll cut it with purpose to not only do good long-term stewardship, but if you're able to recruit future ash. And in terms of the natural niche of white ash, it's a species that, you know, did really well and fairly large openings. So if you really want that ash stump sprout to survive, it's going to need to be first protected, because deer like hone in on those pretty early on, but also you know, in an opening that's at least, you know, 1/3 acre or larger in size. It really is a light demanding tree, which is why it gets so big early on. In terms of the mycorrhizal piece, that's the other interesting about ash and sugar maple and all these species. Some of them are they rely on arbuscular mycorrhizae, some on ectomycorrhizae, and so they also have different forms of mycorrhizae they use. And so hemlock being one that uses ectomycorrhizae, and so even just the forms of mycorrhizal symbionts they have in these systems, when we lose a species like ash, we actually lose kind of a functional type of species in terms of the mycorrhizae it sustains. And so that's something I've learned a lot more about over the last few years. When I'm learning about trees, obviously, how shade tolerant are they? What moisture do they like? But you can pretty quickly find a list of the mycorrhizal associates and kind of the mycorrhizal conditions of trees, and it's worth considering because it's a huge component of how they are resilient and to different dynamics and so forth on a landscape. And so trying to have those processes out there are critical, as well as the habitat that all the small mammals that disperse their spores use as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much for a really informative program. I know, as some of you may know, I'm a big fan of wild forests, and so this was also really useful to have a better understanding of how we can try to emulate those, because we, as you talked about, we are all consumers as well. So,
Yep.
Given that reality, how can we approach forestry in such a way that really tries to maintain the complexity and mimic natural landscapes as much as possible. So thank you so much. If folks do want to stay on, Tony has agreed to answer a couple more questions. So, but for folks who need to go, we totally understand. It's been a while. So next up, actually, I think Jeff had his hand raised first, but since he already spoke, I'm going to give Aaron the opportunity to ask the next question. So Aaron, go ahead.
Thanks, Jennifer. And thanks, Tony. This has been great. I've really enjoyed it. I have a question that's pretty specific to our new community forest in Huntington that Jennifer mentioned at the outset. Thinking about stewardship activities there, I'm a member of the stewardship committee that's working on the plan right now. And one of the things that we're exploring, and I've been doing a lot of thinking about, is managing for more perpetual early successional habitat. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about kind of how that fits into the picture when we're talking about ecological forestry.
No, I think it's so important. And again, I keep looking at Liz and I have an expert on this stuff, but when we look at the landscape of Vermont, old forest conditions, we know are a pretty dominant feature, but we also know that whether it be, and I know you already appreciated by asking this question, whether via beaver activity, certainly, Native American burning. I mean, there were open habitats, and some of those were pretty transient. Other times they were pretty persistent, and that condition, many of the places we built are towns, and we've kind of occupied a lot of that space where we likely would have had that condition. And so I think, when we look at that context piece, and also just this coarse filter strategy, that we want to be providing kind of that habitat structure for kind of the vaster range of species in the region, I think that is also very ecological. And I think a problem of how ecological forestry has been framed in the past is it's got to be old growth, like we got to be emulating old forests. And then again, it's a big piece of it. And then the reason I spoke a lot towards that was that is a lot of what our natural forest condition was like. But having that early, perpetual early successional habitat, if there's opportunities, even, when you're creating that initially, depending on the age of the stand, to leave some of the wood out there just to have some of that structure, and complexity and kind of those initial periods. But, and also, allowing maybe some places to age, not get super old, but just to kind of have that, even that fine scale complexity that we know can be sometimes important in those early successional habitats. Would be critical, but I don't see that being incongruous with ecological forestry in general. In many cases, you're just emulating a disturbance agent, which is primarily beaver, that we don't often factor into kind of the bigger, natural disturbances that affected forests in the region. But there's no way that wasn't they weren't having a huge impact in parts of Vermont and providing that habitat. So, I'm certain, and I've definitely become more appreciative of the need for that over time. As I've just been observing what the general condition is out here. There's also that young piece that's not there. And I think the last piece about that is anybody can create a clear cut, and in general, that's easier said than done, but anybody could create a clear cut, but thoughtfully thinking about how that habitat fits in, and doing it in a place like the community forest, where there's both the opportunity for long-term stewardship and engagement and outreach around that. I mean, to me, it's just there's both from a ecological but also a stewardship and social piece, a lot of reason to do that. So that's cool. What's the general condition of the stand that is it already open to some degree to begin with?
It is, yeah. It's currently like an old field condition that's grown up to young forest in patches, and there's a series of mowed trails, and so it's a really nice matrix of some grassy areas, some shrubby areas, some young tree areas, and kind of exploring opportunities to manage it into that condition long term. And
no, and the thing that I've learned a lot from spending time around like folks like Marco Yamasaki and others have done a lot of bird work. I mean, what I've learned is just how much even our interior nesting species will use that habitat, and so we often assume that those warblers are only in the interior, but especially when they're fledglings, that early successional patch can be really critical for easy access to insects, and certainly a lot more protective cover than you're going to find in a forest stand. So no, I think that's a great thought.
Jeff, did you have another question or comment?
Yes, thank you. A lot of my career has been spent on biomass utilization for wood heat, and I've done a lot of work out in the Northwest, where the Forest Service has a great concern about the low-grade wood contributing to massive habitat-changing fires. Changing, as you would say, the complexity of some of those old growth or older forests, the lower structure catching on fire and then laddering up into the upper stories and completely changing the landscape. The reason I've been able to work there is because Vermont has been a leader in the country on biomass utilization for wood heat.
We are certainly we're certainly a
national leader on heating schools with wood, for example. We have more schools that are heated with wood than any other state in the country, and that's not per capita, which is interesting. How does biomass, in your mind, fit with the management in Vermont or in the Northeast with your concept of ecological forestry?
I think Andrew's question really hit at it. If we want to do any type of habitat management and forest management, we need to have an industry and loggers that are able to survive and do that. And also, again, the landscape you're describing, where they're trying to play catch up, and in many cases, it's a real challenging landscape to think about growing trees into the future, depending on the climate. We're in a region where it's just amazing how much. I mean, again, I'm biased anyway. I love this part of the world, but just have a forest. There is no beginning to the end of them. We talk about a disturbance. Well, there's already trees there. The next day that we're. And so it's just an amazing. And when you think about sustainable production of anything from the forest, it's easy to see that things are going to come back if done the right way. And so when we think about wood heat and more broadly about our future and trying to minimize reliance on fossil fuel, to me there's always been this unfortunate pinning of, well, people said that bioenergy was carbon neutral, and that was a big mistake. It's not carbon neutral, but I won't take credit for it. I get to paraphrase a lot of what our very eloquent commissioner says, but Mike Snyder said it's carbon better, and I think it even, again, not to keep bringing in the equity piece. But when we think about where some of our renewables come from, and obviously there's been a lot of highlighting on that right now with Quebec Hydro, I was getting into electricity, but even, I was kind of shocked that, Dartmouth made the decision to continue to get number 5 diesel, as opposed to, local wood. And if you think of the human life cycle of that fuel source, and kind of how that ties to livelihoods and ties to here, in a very positive way, and then how that ties very negatively globally when we're importing fossil fuel from all over, and just kind of the global political environment that creates. And so I think it's unfortunate, and I nevertheless I respect and I understand those individuals that are not a fan of this. But we need a bridge before we can figure out a very effective way to use renewables that don't have kind of these bigger unexpected impacts. But until then, these other local sources that also do a lot of good for local people, I think need to be front and center, and taken advantage of before we lose those local people to even take advantage of that work. So I'm definitely supportive of it, but also supportive of calling a spade a spade. There are negatives to it, but relative to the other sources, both from a human impact and a carbon impact, I definitely feel much better about those sources.
Yeah, clearly we need to reduce our consumption.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a big key. And
Yeah,
I love wood, but if we never cut another tree again, that'd be awesome, but we've got a long way to go to figure that out. But why not build with a beautiful renewable thing?
Yeah. Okay, this looks like it might be the last question. It's more of a kind of clarification. You mentioned beavers. So Catherine says, Tony, were you saying that beavers are important as natural architects of complex and diverse forest habitat?
They were. They still can be, much to our chagrin. I think we often, well, not to project all of my opinion on that. I mean, I think beaver often, when we intersect with them, it's a nuisance situation. They've gotten into an area and they do what they do. And but if we take away our infrastructure, if we kind of erase the European development in Vermont, and think about what our valleys and any wetland complex would have, if you think the level of fur trade around beaver, and if you were to kind of back translate into what the population of beaver must have been when that was occurring, anywhere. The dam complexes and just that what was happening across the landscape, it would have been a lot of early kind of grassland type condition, with sprouts and tag alder and kind of what you still experience certainly in places like the Victory Basin and other parts of Vermont, where you can still have these large wetland complexes and shrubby areas. And so historically, they very likely were, especially in our larger lowlands and valleys, were again the priority number one for us to move into. So we kind of and again they were pretty actively persecuted for trade, but there's a lot of discussion just of how common they were and just their overall impact, because what one family beaver can do to 100 acre. I mean, it's amazing. And so think about that times at least 100 across the county historically. So that's my sense. And so unfortunately, what now happens is we know that early successional habitat occurred. Again, not 100% of the landscape, 5 to 10% or so. But the places where we want to create it now, obviously we can't. And so we often are doing it in the uplands and so creating, harvests elsewhere. And so it's often hard to argue, a large harvest opening in the upland because it didn't happen too often. But what we're trying to do is at least create that habitat that would have likely been found elsewhere on the landscape that we just can't flood out a town and create marshland and stuff like that. So they were definitely very important naturally as a disturbance agent. And I always forget to mention them, when I always say wind, ice, and insects and disease, but and certainly our wet forests, they were, they still are just incredible agents of change.
Great. Well, in some ways, that's a good place to end because it sort of acknowledges the complexity of the world we live in, right? By thinking about how beavers impacted the landscape and where they are now. And just a lot of complexity there. And so thank you everyone for participating. And thank you so much, Tony, for sharing your knowledge with us. I think I know I learned a ton and I'm sure everyone did. So we really, really appreciate your time.
Yeah, my pleasure. It was really nice to have a chance to talk to you all.
Well, we hope we can get you out to our new community forest.
That'd be great.
Visit.
Just on the road.
Yeah. Sounds good. Thank you, everybody. Good
Take
night.
care. Good night.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks.
Good seeing you, Liz. Take care.
Good to see you.
See you, Ethan. Thanks, Jennifer, for organizing this.
Thank you.
Yeah.